arrogance.
Annually, about 60 groups from all over Europe to discuss the financial crisis of 2008. And we identified this day, the 15th of September, the 10-year anniversary, the exact date of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, as a wake-up call day, a line in the sand, a key moment to come together and cast a critical eye back to see how unfairly this has worked out to the lives of ordinary people in the last 10 years, but also to look forward to whether we have learned the significant lessons that need to be learned to prevent another crisis from happening again. And we concluded that we have not, and that without fundamental changes, another crisis is around the corner. And that's what led to the resolve of all of us to work together to use everything in our power to send a message that unless we change the way that finance works, we are sleepwalking into the next crisis. And I'm very pleased to be able to tell you that today there are actions going on in loads of countries. In France, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in Belgium, all over the place. So representing constituencies affected by austerity, representatives from political parties, and from the NGO community. That we need to reduce the risks, change the gambling behaviour, and aspire to and create a financial system that serves the people and the planet, rather than the other way round. And what we have to offer from the Robin Hood tax campaign is that the financial sector, who got bailed out to the tune of £130 billion and stuck us with the bill, who since the crisis have awarded themselves £50 billion in bonuses, while at the same time that amount has been cut from our schools and our hospitals.
Boo!
What we are offering is that if we just simply take the stamp duty we have on shares and improve it and extend it, get rid of the loopholes, we would raise an extra £5 billion a year. And what would that do? It would give another 1.6 billion to the NHS. It would close the social care funding gap. It would create 20,000 new teaching jobs, and with money left over to pay for 50,000 affordable homes. That's just 1 year. That's the kind of change that we can make happen. So thank you very much for listening to me, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Turner, the Assistant General Secretary for Unite the Union and National Chair of the People's Assembly. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks very much. And I echo the comments there in sending solidarity to the thousands of people standing up today around the world. You can't hear at the back. Oh, I'll have to put my terrace voice back on again. Colleagues, I want to send solidarity to those tens of thousands of people standing up today around the world against the obscenity of growing poverty, attacks on our public services, wage depression, job losses, communities being devastated as a consequence of 10 years of austerity following the collapse 10 years ago of Lehman Brothers. A collapse that started a financial crisis that we haven't seen the likes of across our globe since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Never again, we say, never again will we allow the spivs and the speculators, the casino gamblers, the profiteers to maximise their profit at, of course, the cost to billions of people around our planet that we all pay the price for still today. Gambling away our collective wealth, our wealth, They don't earn money, they don't create money. They were gambling with our money. The money of our nurses and our care assistants, our bus drivers and our refuse collectors, our teachers, our doctors, the unemployed across our communities that contribute so much to social well-being and social cohesion. They gambled with our money, they lost it, and they're still benefiting from our losses. The £50 billion they've taken in profit following the £130 billion bailout that you've already heard of. And never again must we allow the politicians to simply bail them out and give them a get out of jail free card. There should be criminal charges. Not one of these bastards has spent a day, not a day in jail for their crimes. Not one of these bastards has been prosecuted for the actions that they took that have reached such devastating consequences on the communities that we live in today. So never again must we allow our politicians to get away with that. Never again will we be sold out while they're bailed out, of course, and we will not allow them to wreck lives, our public services, and trash our communities in the name of private profit. I'm very happy to represent my union, 90,000 bank workers, ordinary people that work in branches in our communities that very often get paid no more than £17,000 a year and suffer at the moment the consequences of branch closures that are again wreaking havoc in our communities as the elderly and the disabled and the vulnerable that can't travel get branches closed and their access to banks and their finances denied. And we demand an end, an immediate end to those branch closures. We demand an immediate end to the job losses, the 36,000 in RBS alone, whilst they benefit from huge increases to their own profits and take away frontline services. We represent 1.4 million members. Collectively, as a trade union movement, we represent over 6 million workers, all of whom suffer. Not just those in work with growing in-work poverty, but of course the millions outside of work or underemployed in society that still pay the terrible prices of austerity. We've all paid the price, and we demand an end to our paying of the price. We demand our money back, and we demand our money back now. Co-aids, we demand a criminal investigation into their actions and jailing for their crimes. That's the reality of it, and that's what needs to happen. We demand re-regulation of our banking sector to ensure that it can never happen again. And we demand an immediate inquiry into banking provisions across our communities, in our towns and our cities and our rural communities that are being devastated by these closures. Colleagues, we demand an end to austerity, an end to the ideological, powerful, driven austerity by a Tory government that cares very little about those that suffer a consequence from it. We demand a Labour government that will stand up with pride, representing all of our people, and bring hope and opportunity back to our communities devastated with fear and despair. And how proud am I and pleased am I to see John McDonnell here, John standing to my left, who's going to be addressing us later this morning on Labour's plans for a new economy, re-regulating banks and making those bastards pay where they need to pay. Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you very much, Steve. So our next speaker is Zita Holborn. Zita and I go back a long way to the anti-apartheid days. It's really good to see you again. Zita is co-founder and national chair of Barack, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts. She's also national vice president of the union PCS. She's an author, an artist, and a really excellent poet, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Zita Holborn.
Greetings, everyone. I'm glad this has been organised here today. For the past 8 years, since founding Barack UK, myself and my friends and comrades and colleagues have been fighting the cuts, fighting austerity, fighting injustice and racism because of what happened with the collapse. It's effectively devastated the lives of black communities. And when I use the term black, I'm using it in its broadest political sense. So we campaign and support black, Asian, minority, ethnic and migrant communities. And these are the people that have borne the brunt of the cuts and austerity, disproportionately. And hand in hand with that disproportionate impact has come deepening racism, deepening injustice, scapegoating of black and migrant communities, scapegoating of refugees who are fleeing climate change and persecution and poverty. And if you look at the countries those people are fleeing from, they're the countries that Britain built they built their wealth off the backs of those people through enslavement, through colonialism. We know that in times of austerity and in times of cuts, racism and fascism increases. And we've seen that happen across Europe, across the world. When people talk about they've got Trump in the USA, I say, well, we've got Brexit here. Yeah, we've got Theresa May here. We're also facing that deepening racism. And there's been a double or even triple impact on lots of black workers, service users and communities. So if you're a black woman, if you're a disabled black person, if you're a young black person, you have a double impact, a triple impact. And you find that that's impacting on you in terms of jobs, in terms of access to the labour market, in terms of discrimination once you're in work. So we're talking about a community that faced racism before austerity hit, before the collapse. We already faced discrimination in service provision, in the labour market, in education, and so on and so forth. So this has doubled, it's tripled, it's increased, it's deepened, and it's had a devastating impact on people's lives. We're talking about driving people into deepening poverty, people who are working full-time, you know, with maybe 2 earners in a family, having to go to food banks just to survive and put food on the table, having to make real decisions about whether they pay a bill or they put food on the table for their family. Nobody should be having to go through this devastating levels of poverty and discrimination. And when we talk about fighting the far right and standing up to fascism, we also need to stand up to the everyday racism, because what's happened, and it's all interlinked with austerity, with cuts, with the collapse, with discrimination, is that rise of the far right has empowered those who hold racist views to express those racist views. If we look at the Brexit campaign, it was the most racist, divisive campaign that I've seen. We saw a huge increase in racist hate crimes and xenophobic hate crimes. I and my colleagues in Barrack were bombarded with people coming to us asking for support and help to challenge the type of hate crimes they were experiencing and abuse they were experiencing. So for us to say that we're anti-racist, we also have to be for equality. And that means that we have to challenge everyday racism, the racism we see on the streets, you know, the sly remarks that people make, the microaggressions, all of those things have to be tackled, because we can't lift black people out of the injustice that they're facing right here in the UK if we don't also tackle that racism that they face. So we need to be aware, and I think that there's been a real silence since we founded Barrack over the last 8 years about how bad austerity has impacted on black communities. You know, we've been targeted and told, why are you organising just black people? This is impacting on everybody. It is impacting on everybody, but it's impacting hugely and at devastating levels and destructive levels on black communities, and we need to recognise that. So hand in hand with fighting austerity, fighting cuts, fighting for our rights, we must fight racism. We must fight racism in all its forms. We didn't cause the financial crisis. The cuts that have been made by the Tory government, we mustn't forget, are ideological. There's 120 billion that's lost in tax evasion, tax avoidance and uncollected taxes every year, which if collected could meet the deficit. It shouldn't be the poorest people and the most vulnerable people in society that are paying the highest price for the cuts. So we have a responsibility as a collective community, as society, to stand up to that, to say no more, to fight, yes, for a Labour government, because we need a Labour government to turn around what's happened to us, and to say collectively, we do not tolerate or accept any form of racism any day of our life, and we speak out when we see it and experience it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zita. And so I want to welcome Andy Green. Andy is a member of the steering group of Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC. DPAC is made up of disabled people and allies campaigning against the impact of government spending cuts on the lives of disabled people. Please give a very warm welcome to Andy.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? So I was kind of thinking about what to talk about today, and naturally the second came to mind, and I'm going to try and reflect back some of the language that is heard here on a daily basis. And one of the key terms we hear in this part of the world, this part of the city, a lot is value. And I just want to take us back for a second before the crash, because England wasn't a place of Babylon Brooks and cotton clouds for disabled people. We were poorer, we were less likely to be in work. When we were underpaid. We were less likely to own our own homes, we were less likely to go to university. We had lesser lives, but we weren't devalued. We had a long history of struggling back and having a footprint in our society. And then along came the crash. And there was a lot of conversations and a lot of decisions. And the conversations and the decisions that were had here and down the river were about value. And where the government saw value and who it saw value in. When it made those decisions about its responsibilities, and when it made those decisions about where it placed its resources and where it hedged its bets. And it's important to talk about what those decisions were, which meant that disabled people's lives shrunk and shrunk as services were whittled away, as their own part of their lives began to shrink and shrink with no support, no income, no services. But it's also really important to talk about how that was done. And that was done by devaluing disabled people, by creating a narrative about disabled people and welfare and collectiveness bringing down the state and destroying the economy. When we were sold a story about how disabled people were work shy and fraudsters and just swinging it. And we were asked to make value decisions as a population. And the media took up those stories and ran with them, and they amplified them. And we saw that over the years that these stories became common sense values. That disability hate crime rose and rose and rose as we, as a society, started to devalue people all over again, particularly disabled people. Because the people who exploited us for profit during the boom were also now exploiting us for profit during the bust. Because they tried to divide our communities, because in those spaces between communities can be mined for profit. And when we come together and form a collective mass, when there are no cracks between us, it is very difficult to be mined for profit or anything else. And though they may have devalued disabled people, we already knew our worth. And we weren't willing to be passive recipients of these decisions and conversations while they went on over our head. We rediscovered our worth by coming out onto the streets, by being a central part of an anti-austerity movement that fought back against the narrative, that created our own stories and told our own stories. We came out to the streets of London and we shut it down. We did roadblocks and occupations and camps, and we took our story into the heart of Parliament and tried to get onto the House of Commons floor during Prime Minister's question times because we didn't believe their shit and we didn't want other people to believe it either. Our story going forward is about disabled people putting their footprint and their impression on their own lives and on our collective story going forward. If we want to see change, we have to take responsibility for it. Disabled people, everybody has to get out on the streets. Disabled people, everybody has to take a stake. We have to join trade unions. We have to be part of community organisations. We have to get out there and be part of school governorships, tenants and residents associations. We have to take up our place in every conversation and every decision-making body around us. We are no longer prepared to have other people talk about us. We are no longer prepared to have decisions made for us without our story being told and without us being part of that collective going forward. If you want to see change, you won't see it or hear it in areas like this or the one further up the water by Westminster. If you want to see change, you have to speak and do change in your own story. And that is what we have to take from what happened 10 years ago and what happens from today. Solidarity.
Thank you.